Chapter 241, Minister Dumbledore. Saturday, June 22, 1996, Hogsmeade Town, Hogsmeade. Great Britain. Albus Dumbledore had told the ministry officials over and over again that he didn't want to leave Hogwarts and become Minister of Magic. He loved working with the students, and he didn't want to get bogged down with bureaucratic paperwork. He had always argued that there were many other people as qualified as he was to take the job. This time, however, everything was different. They had asked him once again to succeed Scrimgeour as Minister of Magic. However, in this case, there wasn't anyone else even remotely qualified to take the job, as most of the senior ministry officials had been killed in the nuclear explosion. The only people left were the Flames, the Order of the Phoenix, and Cornelius Fudge, who happened to have been in Togo at the time the bombs had gone off. Cornelius Fudge was not an option as he didn't work well under pressure. The Flames tended to be introverts, working behind the scene. Although Nicholas would have been an excellent minister of magic due to the wisdom he had gained over 6 centuries of existence, he didn't have the temperament for minister. There weren't many options among the Order of the Phoenix, either. McGonagall was dead, Sirius was dying, Lupin was dead, and had been a werewolf as well. Hermione was underage, Arthur Weasley was too low-level, Snape was too controversial, and Kingsley Shacklebolt had been caught in 10 Downing Street with John Major when the bombs had gone off. There was Alastair Moody, of course. However, Mad-Eye had freely admitted that both Dumbledore and Dr. Flamel would be better candidates. Dumbledore hated to leave Hogwarts at a time like this. However, it was obvious that it was the right thing to do. Besides, it wasn't as if he wouldn't be around to check on Hogwarts from time to time. The Order of the Phoenix, along with Michael Heseltine and a few members of King William V's Regency Committee, had agreed to set up the new Ministry of Magic in Hogsmeade. All Dumbledore had to do was walk a little, and he'd be able to look in on Hogwarts. The students were going to be stunned at the way the staff had changed over the past year. Snape would be headmaster, Aberforth would be teaching Transfiguration, Slughorn would be back at potions, Mad-Eye would be running defense against the dark arts, and Wilhelmina Grubbyplank would be in charge of care of magical creatures. Perennial Flamel had been convinced to teach history of magic, replacing the hugely unpopular Professor Binns. Although she wasn't exactly a major authority on magic, the simple fact was that she was old. There was actually another, more important, reason for her assignment, however. Nicholas was convinced that the instructions for creating the Philosopher's Stone were in the open now, and he couldn't rule out the possibility that some devious Muggles would try to kidnap or threaten to harm Perennial unless Nicholas helped them create a stone. Dumbledore had an awful suspicion that the mass production of Philosopher's Stones would trigger a crisis even worse than the one Voldemort had. However, the biggest surprise would be the new Muggle Studies teacher, a University of Cambridge anthropology graduate student named Megan Baldwin. Who better to teach Muggle studies than a Muggle? The woman was in her mid-20s and quite attractive. Dumbledore chuckled when he envisioned former Death Eaters suddenly deciding to like Muggles in a hurry when they saw how cute this woman was. He couldn't think about the future right now, however. At the moment, he was accepting congratulations as the new Minister of Magic. Anastasios had come, of course. This had proven to be a mistake, as the Grand Mugwump had immediately been mobbed by grateful Britons, both Muggle and Wizarding, as soon as he had appeared. He had eventually been forced to order his bodyguards to move everyone out of the way so he could talk to Dumbledore. Dumbledore smiled for the cameras as the ceremony completed. He then drew a deep breath and gave his first speech as Minister of Magic. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am flattered by your trust in me. Although I freely admit that I believe that I would be better as the headmaster of Hogwarts than as your minister, I will do everything I can to follow the high standards set by my predecessors. As of today, I am resigning my position as Transfiguration Master at Hogwarts. You may rest assured, students of Hogwarts, that you will still have Professor Dumbledore teaching Transfiguration next year, because I have convinced my brother Aberforth to step in and teach the class. The Hog's Head Tavern will be run by his assistant. Citizens of Britain and the world, we are living in an unprecedented time in human history. The world has been exposed to magic for the first time and has realized that magic can be an amazing source of power for good and for ill. Magic has been used to heal and to harm. Most of wizards are like you and me, simple and honorable people hoping to live a happy and peaceful life. Unfortunately, there are those like Lord Voldemort who use magic's immense power for evil. In a span of 3 hours, millions of people have been killed, and several great cities have been reduced to ruins. The fact that I am issuing this speech from Hogsmeade instead of London serves as a grim reminder of what happened to London. The Ministry of Magic, at least what is left of it, now lies entombed under the water of London's new Lake Scrimgeour, the site of a 50 kT nuclear explosion which served as Lord Voldemort's parting gift. Judgment Day, 20 June, has racked the world. Trying to piece everything together after such a global catastrophe will be extremely difficult, and I doubt that even my immense experience as a wizard will be sufficient to do it all by myself. My friend Anastasio's Dialonis, unfortunately, is not in a position to help because the entire human race as a whole is not under threat. It is up to us, and us alone. We will need to band together to survive in the new world we have suddenly found ourselves in. To this end, I have decided to appoint a very wise and experienced man as my deputy minister. His name is Nicholas Flamel, and he has more wisdom and experience dealing with the world than anyone I can possibly imagine. Those of you who enjoy chocolate frog cards may have heard of him. In addition to the accomplishments listed on Dr. Flamel's chocolate frog card, which I can't get into here, he has also served as a professor in a Muggle institution. As a result, he is perfectly suited for working in a world where Muggles and wizards will be forced to interact on a more regular basis. Dumbledore gestured towards Flamel, who was standing next to him. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Dr. Flamel. He will be at my side the whole time as we face the new future together. Cameras snapped, and Flamel nodded in acknowledgement. People started peppering him with questions, and Flamel delicately deflected the questions, saying that Dumbledore was the important person here. Dumbledore continued, "My first decree as Minister of Magic will be to add some additional restrictions to the use of time turners in Britain. Judgment Day has shown the world that time travel is possible and capable of working amazing wonders. Like any form of magic, the consequences could be disastrous if time turners fell into the hands of someone like Voldemort. To that end, I am requiring that all time turners currently in use in Britain be returned to the Ministry by 1 July. This will prevent them from falling to the wrong hands. People can choose to request a time turner for further study, but all requests will have to have the permission of the Minister of Magic, the Deputy Minister, and the head of the Auror Office. I believe that this will prevent any mishaps involving time travel. We have a lot of work to do, ladies and gentlemen, so let's get started." Chapter 242, Anti-Wizard Political Party. Saturday, June 22, 1996, Rogers' residence in Montgomery, Alabama, United States of America. Judith Rogers knew the truth. The wizards were still a threat, and Anastasio's Dialonis was the exception that proved the rule, or was he? Sure, Dialonis had been instrumental in limiting the casualty totals from Judgment Day to the millions instead of billions. However, what were his motives? She highly doubted that he was as altruistic as he claimed. The fact that Dialonis had the ability to change the entire world order in an instant was deeply disturbing to Rogers. She had been completely convinced that Voldemort was the Antichrist her friends in America, for humans had assured her of that. However, it was fairly obvious now that Voldemort couldn't have been the Antichrist. He had fallen too quickly for that to happen. And although the cataclysm he had triggered had been devastating, it hadn't escalated to the point where it set the entire world ablaze. She now knew why. Pitmos had been wrong, and Guard had silenced him for his mistake. Pitmos had claimed that Radner was the false prophet and that Voldemort was the Antichrist. However, he'd only gotten half of the equation right. Yes, Voldemort had been one of the people mentioned in the Bible, but he had been the false prophet and not the Antichrist himself. That title unquestionably went to Dionysus. Everyone was telling her that Dionysus seemed nice. She tried to remind them that the Antichrist's reign would start off with him being a relatively benevolent ruler who would just turn on the world later. Some people had come around to her point of view and joined her new revelation party. Others, however, couldn't handle the truth. She considered them lost and prayed that God would be merciful in his judgment. She needed to spread the word, and she needed to do so quickly. Otherwise, Dionysus would catch the United States completely unprepared for the catastrophe to come. She had never intended to go into politics. However, she figured that might have a receptive audience here. Her husband Jack had served in the careers with a conscripted America for Humans chapter and had been decorated for bravery. A trained sniper who had originally honed his skills for hunting, he had been one of the few Muggles to actually kill more than one enemy wizard. The fact that she was 31 and quite attractive wouldn't hurt her cause either. If everything went the way she hoped, she might be in a position to get into the Senate and possibly even run for president or be nominated for vice president in 2004 or 2008. She admitted that her group would almost certainly just be a fringe party until Dionysus actually started making a mess of things. However, she could tell that the support was there. Many more militant America for Humans members were defecting to her banner now that the America for Humans staff in Kansas had been forced to concede that good wizards existed. It wasn't that America for Humans had outlived its usefulness. Far from it, in fact. America for Humans had shown its patriotism in the Judgment Day War and had embarked on an extensive recruitment campaign trying to find people who would continue the Judgment Day War against demonstrably evil wizards in the United States. Westboro had forsworn brute force terror attacks now that it knew that some wizards used their powers for good. The headquarters had decreed that it would only go after wizards which had used magic to harm American citizens. Rogers thought that was quite nice of them. They had the right idea. However, they were tackling the problem at the wrong level. America for Humans was trying to stave off the apocalypse by attacking the low-level operatives of the devil. Rogers intended to strike at Lucifer's head, and only at Lucifer's head. There would be no terror attacks against people in the United States because that would kill civilians and tip her hand too early. She didn't want the government rounding her people up like they did with America for Humans after the Quabin attack. There was only one problem she could think of, however. She had to consider the possibility that Dionysus was in fact the false prophet and someone even worse, who actually would take over the world when he first appeared, was waiting in the wings as the Antichrist. If that were the case, God would strike her down for going after the wrong people. She decided that if she were to fall that way, she would tell St. Peter that her actions couldn't have made anything any worse. The major argument that she could think of against Dionysus's candidacy was the fact that he didn't rule a Muggle nation. A powerful wizard with an island city would be one thing. A powerful wizard ruling a country like Russia or the United States, however, would be something entirely different. There wasn't much she could do at the moment, however. All she could do was sit back, prepare, and watch for Dionysus to make his move soul ancestral wizarding shrine South Korea. The wizarding shrine, known in other nations as the Ministry of Magic, had survived the rogue missile launch from Pyongyang completely intact. It had been situated a good 8 kilometers from ground zero and had been hidden a good 200 feet underground. The only evidence of the nuclear explosion had been a few rocks dislodged from the ceiling. The president of South Korea had been whisked to the ministry shortly after the North Korean mortars had started shelling the city. He had initially resisted evacuation, but his aides eventually convinced him to leave. That evacuation had undoubtedly saved his life. He couldn't help but jerk back in surprise when the Bulgarian wizard apparated into the room. It would take a while for him to get accustomed to that, he supposed. But he would. After all, it was part of the New World Order. The new arrival was none other than Stanislav Drakel, the wizard in charge of the forces separating the two Koreas and stopping the war. The man had a look of amazed surprise on his face as he walked over to the Korean president and bowed. "Sir, we've got some interesting updates from the DMZ. It appears that hundreds of people are trying to make their way across the border now into South Korea. They seem to be taking advantage of the lack of organization up in the north and are defecting in droves. We're letting them across the border provided that they are not carrying weapons or are acting suspicious in any way." The South's president nodded. "That's a good idea. Have you run across any would-be terrorists?" "None, sir. We've cleared a 5-foot-wide path through the landmines and put a checkpoint in there. We interview people thoroughly before we let them pass, and we haven't had any problems yet." The 5-foot-wide path was chosen to allow one civilian at a time through, and no mechanized weapons like tanks. "Do they have any news from Pyongyang?" "They do, sir, and very interesting news, in fact. Although Pyongyang is in ruins, there are reports of people all over the country clamoring for Voldemort's democratic reforms to stick. The few generals and warlords still in command up there have their hands tied, sir. They want control, but they don't want to share it with anyone else, and they certainly don't want democracy. And they don't have anyone to fight now that we've sealed off the DMZ." The South's president thought for a moment. "Very interesting. It sounds like the citizens of the North are going to be looking to us more and more for inspiration and leadership. Would you agree with that assessment?" Drakel nodded. "Yes, sir, I would agree with that." There was a long pause, after which the president's eyes widened. "You know what? This could mean reunification. North Korea's capital has been nuked, the nation has fallen into absolute anarchy, and everyone is defecting. No one is supporting the old regime. Now China is apologizing to the world for being imperiused, and the Russians aren't touching North Korea with a 3-meter pole. North Korea is alone and completely isolated. There is nowhere for the old guard there to turn to, and the few members of the old guard who had any power to defy us any longer were killed by Voldemort. Am I imagining something here, or is Korean War over at last?" Drakel thought for a moment. "You may be right, sir. You may be right. Peace at last after almost 50 years. It's a pity it took an international cataclysm to bring us to this point." The South's president nodded emphatically and summoned his aides to discuss this new development. Chapter 243, Harrison and Dumbledore. Sunday, June 23, 1996, Cooper Residence, England. Harrison Cooper stared at Albus Dumbledore. "What? You've got to be kidding. How the bloody hell was I supposed to know that I was going to turn into a monster?" Dumbledore stared at the floor and shook his head. "There's nothing you could have done, Harrison. We've made it a point to restrict knowledge of dangerous creatures from the Muggle world whenever possible, and that includes knowledge of werewolves. We even went so far as to be very ambiguous about the nature of the condition contracted by the people bitten by the monster at Wembley. When we made the public announcement, we only told the victims that they had become werewolves when they were all together. You had the misfortune of being out of the country at the time the announcement was made, and it was our fault that we didn't get to you in time. As the head of the Ministry of Magic, rest assured that we will be providing you with a £1,000 subsidy each month to compensate you for our negligence." Harrison nodded. "I appreciate that, Minister. However, I'm going to need a hell of a lot more money if this lawsuit goes to trial and I get convicted. How much do you know about the plaintiffs so far?" Dumbledore shook his head. "The suit is in a Dutch Muggle court, where I don't have any jurisdiction, and as a result am not privy to all the information. However, From what I've been told, you bit this man while in werewolf form. Harrison winced. Shit. Are you telling me that one of these people is suing me for turning him into a werewolf? It appears so, Harrison. Needless to say, this is a horrible miscarriage of justice. Had this been a wizard in court, you would almost certainly not have been held liable for damages unless you were aware of your condition and had a means to control your transformation. Unfortunately, the attack occurred on a Dutch-flagged cruise ship in a Muggle area. This means that the Netherlands' Muggle laws apply. I'm sorry, Harrison, but there are several precedents for dealing with legal jurisdiction in wizarding and Muggle affairs. Harrison threw up his hands. What a month! I turn into a monster on my vacation and get home just in time for the world to blow up. Now someone sues me for turning him into a monster. Is there any way either you or one of your people will be able to testify on my behalf? Dumbledore nodded. We plan to, Harrison. Furthermore, we have already decided that if you lose the case, we will be paying any fines or penalties. It is not your fault, regardless of how the Muggles rule. Harrison's eyes suddenly widened as he thought of something. Wait a minute. How can someone sue me for being a werewolf in a Muggle court? Muggles don't have werewolves. Dumbledore chuckled. No, Harrison, they don't. Unfortunately, it appears that they're using laws pertaining to attacks by animals. The closest thing they could find was a case where the defendant's pit bull went wild and began attacking other people. There are also references to laws involving permanent disfigurement, which lycanthropy certainly qualifies as an emotional and social trauma. Since you're a werewolf yourself, you can certainly see how someone can be traumatized by such an attack. Harrison grunted. Tell me about it. I've lost several friends, even though I've told them over and over again that it was an isolated incident and that the ministry will be summoning us to London to receive our wait a minute. What's going to happen to us now that London and the ministry has been destroyed? Dumbledore nodded. An excellent question, Harrison. Although the headquarters of the Ministry of Magic was destroyed and flooded by Lake Scrimgeour, the ministry has reorganized itself and reconvened in the wizarding town of Hogsmeade, near Hermione Granger's wizarding school. Harrison nodded. The young woman whose parents were dentists. I know her story, Minister. Clever lass she is, and very brave. I know at least a couple of 20-somethings who are counting the days until she turns 18. What's more, King William supposedly has a crush on her as well. Miss Granger is indeed clever, Harrison. I know her well, as I was headmaster of the school at the time the statute of secrecy fell. As far as His Majesty having a crush on her, well, we'll see how things unfold. However, back to business. There will be a building set aside for the werewolves, and you will be transported over there, where you will be able to transform in safety. Rest assured, Harrison, that you will never have to worry about harming people ever again. Harrison nodded. I'd appreciate that, Minister. Will my wife be able to accompany me? Dumbledore shook his head. I would argue against it, Harrison. Although I am completely convinced that you will not have any problems with this next transformation, it's always best to be careful when it comes to situations like this. Besides, your wife is pregnant, and no one really knows what will happen to the fetus if a pregnant woman is bitten. We have no intention of turning your wife or your daughter into a magical experiment. Harrison winced. Ah, Minister, are you aware that many Muggle couples prefer not knowing the gender of their child until the baby is born? Dumbledore put his hands on his head. Oh dear, Harrison, I'm sorry I forgot. Ever heard of the word obliviate before? Immigration Facility, Boston, Massachusetts. Brenda Snow had heard people speaking many strange languages before. However, she'd never heard anything sounding remotely like this. She'd summoned several linguists and brought them to speak with the three refugees, but none of them could make out heads or tails of what they were saying. It had taken a lot of prodding and experimentation for the Boston customs agents to figure out the refugees' names. She suspected their last name, or at least clan name, was Círdan, because the man had pointed to all three of them and said the word Círdan. Presumably the tattoo on their head was the clan's insignia. The man's name was Zaprit, the woman's Ux, and the daughter's Peant. Snow immediately anglicized them into Alexander, Ursula, and Petunia Searden. It took another half-hour to figure out their ages, 37, 35, and 9, respectively. The crew of the Coast Guard helicopter, which had brought the refugees off the oil tanker, had been absolutely astonished at the refugees' reactions. They had first seemed extremely frightened of flying, shaken their heads vigorously, and pointed at the symbol on their heads. The crew had eventually been able to calm them down, reassured them they were safe, and brought them on board. The family had then gotten all excited when they actually took off. At one point, the little girl had held her hands in front of her sort of like a wizard flying a broom. The two adults had laughed at that and patted her affectionately on the shoulder. The evacuation had nearly met with catastrophe when one of the adults tried to open the door to look outside. Fortunately, the door had been locked, and the man apparently didn't know how to open the lock. The captain told his passengers to put on their seat belts and told one of the crewmen to demonstrate. The refugees didn't like that at all and start pleading in tones which screamed, "Don't do this to us." By the time the helicopter had landed, the crew had pieced together enough to tell Snow that the refugees had apparently run from something and didn't want to get caught. They appeared to be aware of current events, for Petunia's behavior seemed to imply that they knew that wizards existed. No one had any idea how they had found their way into the middle of the Atlantic, far away from any land. Furthermore, the captain suspected that they were escaped peasants or slaves or something like that, as they had gone absolutely bonkers when they were told to put on restraining belts. It was unlikely that they were prisoners, as he couldn't imagine a culture cruel enough to imprison a 9-year-old girl. Well, they didn't need to worry about imprisonment anymore. As of today, they were refugees granted asylum in the United States of America, and Snow would figure out a place for them to live as soon as she determined where exactly they had come from. Chapter 244. Every Man Gets a Tour. Sunday, June 23, 199,663, SBN Dormenweg Curaçao, Dutch Antilles next Pav. 245, J.K. Rowling. 3 days had elapsed since the momentous events of Judgment Day, and I still couldn't wrap my head around the fact that the world had changed forever. Although Boston had been spared a direct hit by either a nuclear weapon or by the fallout from the New York explosion, it was obvious that civilization would not be recovering from Thursday's events for a long, long time. People would be talking about June 20th for a long, long time. Millions of people had been killed, magic had been used on a worldwide scale, and a large part of the Western economy had gone down the drain. Scientists had gone ballistic when they had heard Delorean claim that an asteroid had struck the Mediterranean less than 5,000 years ago. Religious figures, already driven closer together by their shared ordeal, were thunderstruck when rumors came out that the story of the asteroid impact had inspired the biblical story of Noah, and the wizards actually had a written account of the event by the real-life Noah himself, and the record did not match either the Bible or the Epic of Gilgamesh. The phone lines into New York and Miami were alternating between down and completely overwhelmed, with people trying to get in touch with their loved ones. My sister had lost one of her friends in the attack, and a grade school friend of mine who had been living in the Upper West Side had been forced to spend a couple of days in a bomb shelter. John was supposedly on his way back home right now on a bus. The buses, of course, were overpriced and packed as Amtrak service had been disrupted by the attack. My mother's ex-roommate from MIT, Lee Moses, had been sent off to some magical facility in the middle of the Ocala National Forest in central Florida. The facility was so overcrowded that people had been forced to cut down a few trees to make room for emergency shelters. Reports were coming in that the evacuees would be allowed to return to Miami in a couple of days. People who lost their homes in the attack would be allowed to return to Ocala if they so wished. Although the Ocala staff's gesture was undoubtedly the right thing to do, the Muggles' invitation caused some complications. For the first time, Muggles were given extended access to a large facility dedicated to the study of magic. Kenneth Franco, the man in charge of the Ocala facility, had blocked off some of the more classified sections of the facility and urged people to not touch anything they weren't supposed to. Nevertheless, a good 10 to 15% of Ocala's spell components and magical items had mysteriously disappeared, and 3 Muggles had gone insane when antennae had apparently popped out of their heads for no obvious reason. Normally, the highlight of this trip would have been the amazing discovery that my grandfather's house had hosted a secret entrance to the annex of the Curacaean office of the Dutch Ministry of Magic. How could I have known that little iguana-like toadkies scampering around my grandfather's backyard were actually Dutch wizards hiding their existence from my Muggle family? I had played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and read fantasy novels in my youth. I had controlled wizard characters a lot in D&D and figured I knew a lot about what wizards would be like. That, however, had been before that big blue globe of light had enveloped us, and a wizard had come to speak to my family in person. By the time the wizard had finished explaining what had happened, my grandfather's house had attracted a large number of paparazzi. Inevitably, someone asked the wizard if he would be willing to show us around his domain. He hesitated for a moment, then threw up his hands when he realized that people would probably find their way in anyway. Figuring that a trip with a wizard chaperone would be a hell of a lot safer than one without it, he led us all into the backyard and over to the little shed behind my grandfather's house. The wizard pointed at the first room, which I had been told belonged to my mother's family's old housekeeper. This room here was an apartment for the squib who kept an eye on the entrance to the annex, making sure no Muggles accidentally made it in. The middle room here is actually the entrance itself. I blinked. As far as I could tell, the middle room had a washer and dryer in it. The wizard walked over to the washing machine and tapped his wand 4 times on the door. The door sprang open, and the wizard turned to face the rest of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, here is the entrance. All you have to do is stick your head in there, and you'll be sucked through into our magical world. Don't worry, it's completely safe. Give me a few moments, however, so that I can prepare the staff for your tour. It shouldn't take long." With that, he stuck his head into the washing machine and vanished. People muttered excitedly, and I took out my camera. With all the engineers in my family, I figured that someone from MIT would want to take a look at this Cornwall, Ontario. Jesper Ettel looked around the hospital. It could have been a hell of a lot worse. Most of the contaminated water in the St. Lawrence had been stopped at the dam and eliminated by Sorceress Kirchetova and the rest of the rescue team. However, some of it had made it into Cornwall's water supply, and a lot of people had checked into the hospital with mild symptoms of radiation poisoning. Realizing what this meant, Ettel had told Prime Minister Crescent to distribute bottled water all along the St. Lawrence between Lake Prescott and the site of the dam. It looked as if the vast majority of the sick people were going to survive. However, just in case, Ettel helped distribute iodide capsules to the patients, casting the duplication charm on them when they ran out. It would be a long, long time before the people of Ogdensburg and Prescott would be able to return home. The few people who had survived the explosion were now living in Toronto or Buffalo, depending on their nationality, and would be doing so for the foreseeable future. Oval Office. Cameras, both Muggle and wizarding, flashed as Grand Mugwump Dialanis lifted what was once the Sumerian key into the air. The key was ancient and had not seen use in over 3,000 years. That had been, of course, before June 20th. It was the Sumerian key no longer. Instead of the bearded lion on the handle, the key sported a bald eagle. Admitting that the world had changed during the 3,600 years since the last Judgment Day, He decreed that it was time to reassign the two Muggle Judgment Day keys to the two superpowers of the modern era, the United States and Russia. Boris Yeltsin had already accepted the Pharaonic, now known as the Romanov key. Now, it was Clinton's turn to take responsibility for the American key. Clinton thanked Dialynis gravely for the key and ordered that it be sent to the NORAD facility at Cheyenne Mountain and placed under extreme protection. That way, there would be no possibility of people losing track of it again. Chapter 245. J.K. Rowling writes some books. Sunday, June 23, 1996, Lake Hogsmeade Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Great Britain. J.K. Rowling had always thought that she would have been a good fantasy writer, especially when it came to stories about wizards and magic. She doubted that any of her books would have become bestsellers, but who knows, she could always get lucky. Nevertheless, nothing in her wildest fantasy imaginations could have rivaled what she was doing right now. She and a technician were currently crammed into a small submersible diving into the lake outside the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Having been ordained the Daily Mail's primary columnist on magical affairs shortly after her interview with Harry Potter, she was heading down into the lake to conduct an interview with the Merchieftainess, the enigmatic woman who had appeared during the raid on the Cup Horcrux. Her star had risen rapidly after she announced that she and Harry Potter had reached a deal to write a 7-book series about the young man's experiences at Hogwarts. These documentaries would introduce the Muggle world to the lives of young British witches and wizards. The first book was going to be called Harry Potter and the Magical Orb, and it was scheduled to be released in May 1998. It would likely be followed by Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, and Harry Potter and the Super Bowl Breach. All of the proceeds would go to charitable funds dedicated to the reconstruction of London, New York, and the other cities which had suffered nuclear explosions during the Judgment Day War. Neither Harry nor Rowling knew what the 6th and 7th years would be like after all. They were still in the future. She was very lucky to have survived the attack on London. She had been busy covering the Bentley Pegasus, which was slowly starting to come into production when the bombs had gone off. Most of the Daily Mail staff had been killed in the blast, having gone to the Ministry of Magic to interview celebrating wizards. She was fairly certain, however, that she would find employment somewhere in the post-Judgment Day world. And judging from the long lines of overworked people, unemployed people, and people who had taken pay cuts, that was a great accomplishment. She couldn't focus on Harry Potter or her future right now, as the submersible's headlights were revealing a small underwater city. Merpeople stared at the submarine in confusion and started asking each other what the hell it was. One of them tried poking it with a trident, and the technician had been forced to retract their Alvin's claws to make it appear less threatening to the inhabitants. The merpeople seemed to be civilized and clearly intelligent. They didn't seem particularly happy that the Muggles were visiting. Then again, what were they supposed to think when something or someone they had never seen before was barging its way into their city? Finally, the loudspeaker broadcasting into the water picked up the Merchieftainess's voice. "All right, Muggles, that's about far enough. This is a first contact situation, and we don't want to scare anyone here. I'd recommend that you turn off your torches as they are frightening the locals. Have you seen enough of the city to report it to the rest of your world?" Rowling reached for the intercom as the technician turned off the lights and gasped as the city below was illuminated by faint green phosphorescence. "Yes, Your Excellency. You have a wonderful community down here. You should be proud of it." "Thank you, Madame. I'm glad to hear that you're not one of those people who frown upon non-humans." Rowling nodded. "Rest assured, Your Excellency, most of us are not like that. How many of you live here?" The Merchieftainess paused for a moment. "About 2,000 at last count. We have diplomatic ties with the Wizards of Hogsmeade and Hogwarts, and I have spoken to Headmasters Dumbledore, McGonagall, and Snape several times. Have you interacted with Muggles before? We have traditionally tried to avoid them, Madame. The statute of secrecy forbade interaction, of course. However, there are times when we try to rescue drowning victims, and when we do so, we take the form of dolphins. Rowling's eyes widened. Dolphins? You mean dolphins are actually wizards? Not necessarily, Madame. Although all disguised merpeople look like dolphins, not all dolphins are merpeople. Fascinating. I see that your species is humanoid. How closely are you related to us? The Merchieftainess paused. It's strange, Madame. As far as we can tell, we have no common ancestor. It appears that we just happen to look similar and are both intelligent. Can you breed with humans? Yes, but the offspring always dies before age 2. Can you breathe air? Are you amphibious? We can breathe air, but not very well. We generally can't stay out of water more than a couple of hours at a time, and when we do, we have trouble walking around as our feet were not meant for land use. There was a lot of stuff Rowling wanted to ask her. However, she had to get back to her major questions. Your Excellency, were you aware of what has just happened on the surface? Yes, Madame. From what we've been told, there was a global crisis which necessitated the declaration of Judgment Day. Apparently, this crisis was precipitated by the actions of the evil wizard Lord Voldemort. We would like to offer our sincere condolences to anyone who was affected by those tragic events. Thank you, Your Excellency. You're familiar with Voldemort. Yes, Madame. He was a student at Hogwarts many years ago, and a brilliant one at that. It is a pity that he turned to evil. He would have made a great asset to society. Ciudadani Council Chamber Ciudad State of Ciudan Atlantic Ocean. Supreme Chancellor Ortilu looked at the two other members of the ruling committee, Cyatnan and Vixar. Vixar had a troubled look on his face, and Cyatnan looked as if she wanted to punch somebody in the nose. Ortilu drew a deep breath. So what you're telling me is that during the chaos of Judgment Day, several Muggle slaves tried to escape. Vixar nodded, and he didn't look happy. Yes, Ms. Ortilu. As we had feared, there was a mass breakout among the Yahoos while the wizards were occupied with the Judgment Day protocol. The overlords reported 325 Muggles escaped. We've combed the island and the waters offshore looking for the escaped slaves. We were very thorough, and we got a complete head count. Ortilu had a bad feeling about this. Complete head count. How many did you find? Vixar bit his lip. 322. 3 of them are still missing, 2 adults and a little girl belonging to Altry. All of our magical defenses seem to be unanimously reporting that they are not within 50 miles of Círdan. Did you check underwater? Perhaps some of the animals ate them. Cyatnan nodded. We checked underwater, and they weren't there. There also weren't any new human bones in the area, so the animals couldn't have eaten them. There is only one possibility left that I can think of, and it's very disturbing. Ortilu grunted, and that is. They managed to escape to a Muggle ship, which had happened to approach Círdan a few days after Judgment Day. The Muggles didn't see the island, of course. However, if the 3 missing slaves escaped on a raft, which wouldn't be the first time someone tried to do that, and the Muggles saw the raft. Ortilu understood immediately and swore. The Muggles would find out that we've been enslaving their colleagues. They wouldn't be happy about it. Are you sure that the defenses around the island are still warding off any Muggle intervention? Yes, Ms. Ortilu. However, I'm not sure that will hold now that the Muggles and wizards are starting to mingle. And may the gods help us all if Nestor decides to wade into this and side with the Muggles against us. Markali has been looking for an excuse to fight with us again for a while, and she'll probably jump at anything. We do not want angry Vila running all over the place here again. Ortilu shuddered. That's just what we need. Wonderful. First a Judgment Day, then a bunch of Muggles mad at us for enslaving the Yahoos decide to ally with Nestor. See what you can do to find those missing slaves. If they're on the mainland, get them back fast. If necessary, kill them. And hope the Muggles Don't have anyone who speaks Siadani. The other two chancellors nodded. We'll do that, madame. Chapter 246. Stock Market Crash continues. Monday, June 24, 1996. British Werewolf Rehabilitation Centre, Hogsmeade, Great Britain this time. Harrison Cooper wasn't taking any chances. He had hoped that Minister of Magic Dumbledore had been mistaken and that his transformation on the ship had been an isolated incident. Unfortunately, the headaches had started up once again, just as the wizard had predicted. He was still a werewolf, and on July 1st, the next full moon, he would once again turn into a dangerous monster. He had immediately followed Dumbledore's advice and headed over to Hogsmeade, a town he had never known existed, to pick up some of the bizarre potion which would mitigate his lycanthropy symptoms. Originally, the werewolves were to have been treated in a secure area near the Ministry of Magic. Voldemort's nasty surprise had wrecked those plans in a hurry, however, so the wizards had to make do with what they had. This posed a problem for the Muggles, however, in that the Muggles had no way to get to Hogsmeade. Dumbledore and his staff had circumvented that problem, however, and done so in an ingenious way. They had placed Portkey's magical transportation devices at specific addresses in Manchester, York, the surviving areas of London, and several other large cities. They were designed to transport the Muggle bite victims, and only the Muggle bite victims, to Hogsmeade for treatment. They would then send the victim back to where he had started with his medication and any information he needed. Harrison found the experience of traveling by Portkey frightening at first, but eventually he got accustomed to it. It occurred to him that this invention could revolutionize transportation throughout Britain and possibly the world. It wasn't quite Star Trek transporter beams, but it was close. The only problem with Portkeys is that they often provided the traveler with hard landings. The Hogsmeade staff had anticipated this, however, and Harrison found himself falling into a pile of cushions as the magicked paperweight fell out of his hand. He got to his feet and looked around the room. The room seemed to be a laboratory of some sort, with beakers filled with strange liquids bubbling on fires. At the far side of the room stood two people, a woman he recognized from the football match and a man with greasy black hair. They appeared to have been discussing a good-sized vial in the man's hand. Both people turned to him as he stood up. The woman looked at him curiously and frowned. "This is odd. I recognize you from the football match, but I don't remember seeing you last month." The greasy-haired man nodded. "Indeed, Mrs. Mistry. Unless I am badly mistaken, we have finally brought Harrison Cooper into our midst." Harrison nodded. "Yup, I'm Harrison Cooper. I've come here because I've discovered I'm a werewolf and someone here can help me." The man nodded. "That would be I, Mr. Cooper. I am Headmaster Severus Snape of the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. This woman here is Lauren Mistry, another new lycanthrope. Both of you were bitten by Remus Lupin in the football stadium." Lauren looked at him curiously. "If you were bitten and weren't here last time, how'd you manage the transformation last month? Were you immune to some extent?" Harrison winced and shook his head. "Don't remind me. I never found out until it was too late, and the full moon occurred when I was on my honeymoon in the Caribbean. I transformed on a Dutch cruise ship and bit several people, possibly even killing a dozen. When I found out, I was absolutely horrified. Thankfully, the wizards caught me before I could do too much damage. They apparently tranquilized me and sealed me in a lifeboat the rest of the night. I've been having nightmares ever since. Thank God I remember nothing of it." Lauren stared at him in amazement, and Snape drew a deep breath and nodded. However, Harrison wasn't done yet. "Oh, it gets worse. You see, one of the people I bit on the boat is suing me for emotional and physical trauma. Since the attack occurred on a Muggle cruise ship, it is going to be handled by the Dutch Muggle court system using laws pertaining to animal attacks." Snape swore. "Mr. Cooper, that is going to be a problem. Although I can tell you for absolute certainty that you would be acquitted in a wizarding court, the fact that you are being tried by Muggles is going to make things complicated." At any rate, I am afraid that I must complicate things even further. You see, one of the people you bit was a British citizen. This means that you will very likely be meeting her here during the upcoming week." Harrison's face went white when he realized where Snape was going. She probably isn't going to like me very much. Snape reached into his robe and withdrew a necklace with an odd symbol on a pendant hanging from it. "Hardly, Mr. Cooper. She's threatened to attack you as soon as she sees you. As a result, we have determined that you are going to need special protection for your own safety. This pendant will prevent Muggles from harming you as long as you are within Hogsmeade. Put it to good use." Harrison thanked the wizard and put on the necklace. He didn't feel any different, but he assumed the wizard knew what he was talking about. Snape nodded, opened up a briefcase, and withdrew a vial similar to the one he had seen earlier. "Now, to the business at hand. All werewolves are going to receive vials like this. They contain 6 doses of the wolfsbane pill. I am afraid that you will have to take 8 tablets a day to ward off most of the symptoms, and there will likely be side effects, as the pill has not yet been perfected. If you have any side effects, tell one of us immediately. It is possible that the pill may not work as planned. If that's the case, come back and we'll brew wolfsbane potion for you manually each day. The wolfsbane potion is going to work, but its efficacy wears off after about 24 hours. The pills are an attempt to make a version of the draft, which will not have an expiration date." Harrison accepted the vial and put it in his pocket. He was not going to go through that ordeal on the ship again. No way. He'd kill himself before that Boston Stock Exchange, Boston, Massachusetts. The New York Stock Exchange was gone. However, the citizens of Boston and Philadelphia had done yeoman work in preparing their stock exchanges to handle the influx of investors and traders who had been working on Wall Street. About 30% of the traders had been killed in the blast. The remaining 70% had been split between Boston and Philadelphia until a permanent solution could be found. Bill Clinton had closed the stock market immediately after the destruction of New York and told the country that trading would be suspended until Monday. The Dow Jones had been at 59.38 at the moment. Trading had been halted on the 20th. The Undersecretary of Magic had come to open the trading session herself today. However, even Ariadne couldn't do anything about what had happened next. By the time 100 had come along, the Dow Jones had fallen to 37.27. That was a 37% drop in a span of a few hours. Markets were reacting all over the world. There were stories of stockbrokers jumping before trains and falling from bridges. People were running on banks. It was like the 1929 stock market crash all over again. Far away, in the Oval Office, the president wondered if his entire re-election bid depended on how he handled this sudden cultural, military, and economic crisis. The world had changed in a span of 3 hours, and Clinton's entire career depended on his response. St. Elizabeth's Hospital, London. The surgeon looked at the readouts showing Sirius Black's vital signs and shook his head. "This is not good. Not good at all." His assistant nodded grimly. "I concur. He's too far gone. He absorbed too much radiation from those blasts in Pyongyang. It's a miracle he's alive at all." The surgeon shook his head. "He may be a wizard, but there are probably things even a wizard can't handle. I recommend that we hand him off to Dumbledore or someone else in the Ministry of Magic. The Ministry is the only chance he's got, and I suspect they'll accept him given the fact he's a wizard and a national hero to boot." The assistant nodded and began preparing the papers to present to Dumbledore. In the meantime, the surgeon wheeled Sirius out of the room and wheeled in the next patient. Chapter 247, Mighty Mouse. Tuesday, June 25, 1996, Herald Green Pharmaceutical Corporation, Charleston, South Carolina, United States of America. David Hendrickson mixed the ingredients carefully, following the instructions in Flamel's text to the letter. He had to call upon several of his friends in the Charleston Annex of the Ministry of Magic to provide some of the spell components, and he had been forced to spend exorbitant sums of money buying magical objects, liberated from the Ocala National Forest facility by the Miami residents who lived there after the bomb had gone off in Florida. He wasn't worried about the money. If everything had gone according to plan, he would soon be in a position to produce gold out of lead. Mr. Green, realizing the repercussions immediately, had gone out of his way to spend a few $1,000s buying large quantities of lead. The premise, of course, was that he was going to be conducting a study about the dangers of lead in plumbing and piping systems. Very few people other than himself and Harold Green's executive committee knew about the Philosopher's Stone project. Hendrickson wasn't out of the woods yet, though. For one thing, he had no idea if the stone was actually going to work. He suspect Flamel had spent a lot more time working on the stone than he himself had. More importantly, however, was the obvious fact that the British government knew that something was up and that the stone was in danger of coming out. Hendrickson had been horrified to hear that Flamel was now the Deputy Minister of Magic. That seemed totally out of character for the ancient wizard, who generally shunned the limelight and preferred to teach medieval literature to Muggles. The only explanation was that Dumbledore, his friend, and now Minister of Magic, had convinced him to come on board because both men knew what would happen if the stone got loose. For the first time, Hendrickson began to worry whether he was opening Pandora's box by trying to recreate the stone. If the wisest man in the world, at least in terms of age, had recommended that the stone be destroyed, he may have a point. Samuel's warning about mankind not having the wisdom to use power wisely resounded in his head, particularly after the events of Judgment Day. Unfortunately, he had already agreed to undertake this task for Harold Green. In an economy which had suddenly gone into a nosedive, Hendrickson couldn't risk doing anything which could undermine his professional career. He had to make the stone, and if necessary, make sure that it was used wisely. Drawing a deep breath, he tilted the final flask and poured the final ingredient into a tube the size of a soda can. Sparks flared everywhere, and the room was filled with acrid smoke. The fire alarms went off, and he heard people hurrying through the halls as they began to evacuate the building. He stayed where he was, however. After all, there was no fire, and he was able to clear the air with a wave of his wand. If anything, the evacuation would make sure that no one saw what was supposedly growing in the bottom of the tube. He took advantage of the opportunity to sneak into a nearby laboratory, don a protective suit, and steal one of the Norway lab rats which had been used in a biological experiment. This particular rat was very sick, having been infected with a tricky influenza strain. It spent most of its time sleeping and trembling, curled up in a little ball. He doubted that it would last more than a couple of more days. He had no idea if the rat would make him sick, but he figured it wouldn't hurt to wear the bunny suit at a time like this. He placed the cage with the rat on his work table and waited for the tube to cool off. He then looked over the instructions one last time and saw, to his dismay, that it would take 30 minutes for the stone to form. This put him in a difficult position. He'd have to leave the building, or at least make himself invisible, because the fire wardens and the fire service would want to check out the alarm, and they would be most unhappy at seeing him, along with a sick experimental rat, still in the building. Hoping that no one would steal his idea, he threw an extra hospital gown over the tube, book, and the rat, and hurried out into the parking lot with the rest of the staff. He rushed back into the lab as soon as the all-clear horn sounded. He was troubled when he saw that someone had removed the gown and exposed the tube, rat, and book. Fortunately, everything seemed to have been undisturbed. The only thing which appeared to have changed was that the rat had managed to limp its way over to the other side of the cage. It appeared to take forever. However, eventually the clock on the other side of the room reached 30 minutes. Gingerly, barely able to breathe, he walked over to the tube and poured its contents into the sink. A huge, ugly brown mess came out with a large lump in the middle. Hendrickson's heart sank. This did not look like a philosopher's stone. If anything, it looked like vomit. Furious with himself, he opened the faucet to wash away the evidence. His anger turned to hope, however, when he saw that the brown goo had been covering a red stone the size of a golf ball. Hendrickson looked at the stone in anticipation. Was this it? There was only one way to check. Hurrying back to Flamel's manual, he mixed a few more potion ingredients in a flask, picked up the red stone with tongs, and dropped it into the liquid. He then covered the flask with a grating to block out impurities and turned it upside down. Slowly but surely, a brilliant white liquid began draining from the flask. He captured some of it in a test tube and filled an eyedropper with a small dose of it. It wasn't much. However, rats weren't big animals. He hurried over to the cage with the sick lab rat and withdrew the animal's water bottle. Gingerly, he injected the white fluid into the bottle and stirred vigorously so it dissolved into the water. He then focused his attention on the rat, whose behavior had suddenly changed. The rat had been lethargic and lackadaisical ever since Hendrickson had brought the cage into the room. Now, however, it was stumbling to make its way over to the water bottle. It had paid no attention to the water bottle prior to that moment, Hendrickson realized. Something had changed, which had attracted the rat's attention, and Hendrickson had a strong suspicion he knew what it was. In obvious pain, the rat made it all the way over to the tube dispensing the water and took a drink. Hendrickson noted the time and jotted it down in his lab book. For the first 5 minutes, nothing really happened. The rat continued to drink and drink and drink. Hendrickson figured that the animal knew that the water was good for it and wanted to consume as much as possible. He left for the bathroom at that point. By the time he had returned, the rat had totally transformed. Hendrickson couldn't believe what he was seeing. The animal was no longer shaking. Its eyes were open, and it seemed significantly stronger. Some of the bald spots on its body were starting to regrow downy fur. Hendrickson took several photographs to document this experiment. It was obvious that the rat was healing, and healing rapidly. Excited, he removed the water bottle much to the rat's chagrin, as the animal seemed to want more, and sealed it for future experimentation. The rat began running around the cage, chasing the water bottle. It tried to climb the bars running along the walls to get at the water bottle, but it was to no avail. Irritated, it finally started running in its wheel. Hendrickson put away the red stone and the water sample, put on a fresh set of gloves, and lifted the rat out of the cage. The animal had gotten very feisty, and Hendrickson could have sworn that it was happy that it felt better. Gingerly, the wizard picked up a needle and drew some of the creature's blood. The rat whimpered a little and tried to escape, but he was still able to get a sample. He sent the blood sample off to one of the other labs in the building and asked it to report on how much of the influenza virus was present in the rat's blood. The lab had reported that before the experiment, the rat had 1.23 units of influenza inside it. No wonder the animal was sick. He could barely work while the lab processed the second blood sample. Finally, however, the door opened and the technician handed him the results. 0.007 plus 0.0006. Hendrickson screamed in delight and threw his arms around the poor woman, telling her that he had made an amazing discovery. The woman congratulated him, but then frowned. "Mr. Hendrickson, are you sure that's the same rat? There's no way someone can get rid of that much of the virus in a matter of 20 minutes. Hendrickson looked around the room. "Trust me, Lindsay, it's the same rat. Do you see any other rats in this room?" Lindsay shook her head. "No, I must confess that I don't. However, from what I know, this rapid a recovery is impossible. Yes, I know you're a wizard, but from what people have told me, even wizards can't cure a disease that efficiently and that quickly." Hendrickson grinned. "They can now, Lindsay. They can now. And unless I'm very mistaken, everyone else will soon be able to as well, for a fee which will make every member of Herald Green Pharmaceutical Corporation very, very rich." Lindsay grinned. "That would be wonderful." Let's hope that the results of the rat experiments work out on dogs, chimpanzees, and humans. I doubt we'll make a lot of money if we've just discovered something which work only on rats. Hendrickson nodded. Believe me, I'm going to start working on the other animals as soon as possible. However, I must confess that this is a very, very good start. Lindsay nodded and looked over to the work table. Frowning, she picked up the philosopher's stone. Where'd you get the paperweight? Hendrickson was barely able to keep himself from laughing. Chapter 248. Invisible Troops. Tuesday, June 25, 1996, Seoul Ancestral Wizarding Shrine, Seoul, South Korea, Mr. President, they want to do it. They're serious about it this time. The President of South Korea, spun as Stanislav Drakel, materialized in the Ancestral Wizarding Shrine. As the man in charge of the peacekeeping force separating the two Koreas, he had been chosen to be the intermediary as the two Koreas discussed the repercussions of the events leading up to Judgment Day. The fact that he was not a Korean, and he was a wizard to boot, where the wizards had little experience with Muggle politics, made him an excellent choice. The president smiled for the first time in a long while. They're starting to ask for reunification with the South and an end to the fighting after all these years. Yes, sir. A brief poll my men from Durmstrang conducted around the country shows 84% of the country in favor of democracy and 53% in favor of reunification. The old government up there has completely collapsed, and the few remaining warlords left are killing each other off. The UN is starting to assert more power, and people are continuing to flee south in droves. We've had to clear away more landmines to prevent them from waiting too long at the border. The Minister of Magic, who had been listening to the conversation, breathed a sigh of relief. Ancestors be praised. The Korean War over at last. It is a pity that it nearly took a nuclear holocaust to trigger a permanent peace. The President nodded. I can't agree with you more, Minister. I can probably speak for a lot of people here when I tell you that I lost many friends in Seoul during the initial artillery barrage and the final nuclear attack. No one spoke for a while after that, and several people bowed their heads in grief. Eventually, the Minister of Magic collected himself and turned back to the President. Sir, what would you recommend for the next step? We can't just annex them. For all we know, they may be content to have a truly democratic state of their own, with a rebuilt Pyongyang as its capital. The President nodded and turned back to Drakel. That's a good point. All right, Wizard Drakel, here's what I think we should do. Get in touch with the UN forces running what's left of the government and tell them to meet with us. The goal is to hash out a unification, democratization, and/or relief plan to be announced no later than the 1st of July. Yes, we've got 1 week to do it. I'd start with having the North vote on a referendum on whether to stay communist or become capitalist. If they decide to become capitalist, then we'll discuss the possibility of reunification. Drakel nodded. That's a good idea, Mr. President. I'll see to it right away. Presidential Palace, Baghdad. Saddam Hussein was amazed at the way his luck had changed over the past week. A week ago, he was one of the most hated men in the world. Now, he was one of the two Muggle leaders who had helped make Judgment Day a reality. He and Hosni Mubarak, who had never really seen eye to eye after the Egyptian forces had helped defend Kuwait in the Gulf War, had managed to bring the world back from the brink of nuclear war. The world owed both him and Mubarak a great deal for their participation in the Judgment Day Protocol. Mubarak was already thinking of asking for the Sudanese to recognize Egyptian control of the Habibi Triangle. The Egyptian had toyed with asking for Gaza and parts of the Negev, but had decided against it, as most of the world had been sympathizing with Israel ever since that bomb had gone off in Tel Aviv. Mubarak's idea of occupying some disputed land put an interesting idea into Saddam's head. The Iraqi leader still firmly believed that Kuwait was a province of Iraq. He had tried to liberate the Sultanate back in 1991 and had been rudely rebuffed. That was then, however. This was now. Certainly, the United Nations would give him some part of Kuwait for his troubles. He considered whether another invasion would be warranted. The British and the Americans would probably stay out of it, as they were busy licking their nuclear wounds. The big question marks would be Iran and the Saudis. Saudi Arabia and Israel were growing closer together, as Fard felt somewhat responsible for the attack on Tel Aviv. If those two nations formed a military alliance, a threat to Saudi Arabia, such as an invasion of Kuwait, would likely draw Israel into it. With Tel Aviv already in ruins, Israel would probably be very angry. Saddam couldn't rule out the possibility of the Israelis getting away with a nuclear strike as a just response for what happened to Tel Aviv. Iran, of course, was a different matter. Saddam hadn't heard much from the Iranians over the past week. Were they thinking of resuming hostilities? The country had a deep magical tradition, which likely meant they had wizards running around. Iran had already fought Iraq once. Would they try to take advantage, an Iraqi advance, into Kuwait by sending some wizards into the fray? Saddam wondered if it was time for him to try drafting wizards into the country's army. There had to be wizards around here somewhere, after all. Maybe he could see if he could talk to the Minister of Magic, if such a man existed. That was a worst-case scenario, however, and he doubted that would be necessary. The most likely scenario would be for him to try to be allowed to take over a little piece of Kuwait, wait a while, then grab another, and another, and another. By the time the Kuwaitis figured out what was going on, their country would be part of Iraq. Saddam set to work on figuring out how to make that happen. Deploying troops would be too obvious a strategy. Deploying invisible troops, however, would be a much smarter thing to do. Sure, they wouldn't be able to see each other, but they would be a very big surprise to anyone on the other side if they took their invisibility cloaks off. He needed to find a wizard, and do so quickly. He wondered if some of the Death Eaters who had been members of Al-Qaeda or Hamas needed some protection. The burrow, Great Britain. The doorbell to the burrow rang. Ron Weasley opened it and was astonished to see most of the Order of the Phoenix there. The main exception was Dumbledore, who was presumably executing his duties as the Minister of Magic. Tonks nodded and spoke. Ron, good, you're going to want to hear this as well. I need for you to bring Harry and Dudley here quickly. Something urgent has come up, and you're going to have to come with us. Hurry, there's no time to lose. Ron didn't like the look on the people's faces. What had happened? Had something happened to Dumbledore? Concerned, he went up and retrieved the other two boys. Harry was busy studying for his belated owls, and Dudley had distracted himself with a Walkman. Ron was disturbed to see his guests' faces become even sadder when Harry walked into the room. Clearly, they were trying to get in touch with Harry. It must be Dumbledore, Ron thought. Harry and Dumbledore are very close. Harry looked at his guests, and his eyebrows shot up. Where are Professor Dumbledore and Sirius? Should Hermione come with us too? Snape answered this. Professor Dumbledore is currently executing his duties as Minister of Magic. Princess Diana, the King Mother and member of the Regency Committee, is busy trying to reach Miss Granger, who has been kept busy by her duties as one of most popular witches of Britain. You will want to have her with you as well, Potter, for you will need to be strong for this. You are certainly stubborn enough to do that, I think. It took a second for Harry to realize what Snape was implying, but when he did, he gasped. It's Sirius, Headmaster. Something's happened to Sirius. No one spoke for several seconds, and many of the Order members looked around awkwardly. Finally, Moody put his hand on Harry's shoulder and spoke. Harry, I don't know how to say this, but Sirius is dying. Chapter 249. Atlantis addresses the Un. Wednesday, June 26, 1996. United Nations Building Geneva ** warning. Major character death flashbulbs went off in droves as Atlantis walked to the podium. In his hand were 2 sheets of parchment. The first was the text of the speech he was about to deliver, going into the details of the Judgment Day operations. The second was a copy of Noah-Pishtin's account of the first Judgment Day, translated into English. In theory, he was not supposed to intervene in Muggle affairs, since Atlantis was at DEFCON 3, and likely to go to DEFCON 4 now that it seemed increasingly obvious that the world was slowly starting to return to normal. However, he figured he could make an exception because the world had just gone through a Judgment Day. Besides, he wouldn't be dictating any policy here. He lay the paper with the prepared speech on the podium and told everyone to be seated. The crowd complied, and he began to speak. "Good morning. My name is Anastasios Dialanis, and I am the Grand Mugwump of the International Confederation of Warlocks. The IQA is an international organization dedicated to the study of magic and international diplomacy. You can think of it as a combination of an elite wizarding research and development center and the magical United Nations. I come from the magical city-state of Atlantis, which until recently was hidden by the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Now that the statute of secrecy has been lifted, Atlantis has resurfaced and will be staying above ground for the time being. I am currently involved in discussions to allow Muggles to tour the facility and meet several of the city's inhabitants. As Grand Mugwump, I am the highest-ranking wizard on the planet. The Judgment Day Protocol was enacted under my authority and that of head astrologer Endukaku. I have called this press conference to explain what exactly happened on the afternoon of the 20th and to provide some more information on an earlier Judgment Day declaration almost 5,000 years ago. First, let me explain the conditions required for Judgment Day. Judgment Day can only be declared if the head astrologer agrees that there is a greater than 30% chance of the end of civilization. It is, in effect, humanity's last chance at rectifying the situation before society falls apart. At the time the Judgment Day events actually took place 1500 Z on the 20th, this value was 39.1%. The actions taken by the people of Atlantis reduced that value to under 3%. Everyone clapped and cheered at that. Dialanis had to wait a good 30 seconds before he was able to continue. That 39.1% consisted of roughly an 80%, probably of a full nuclear exchange, and a 50% probability that the exchange, should it occur, would cause the downfall of civilization and send the world back into the Stone Age. Had civilization collapsed in this manner, we estimated that a good 85–90% of the people on the planet would have perished by the year 2020. As I mentioned before, this is the third Judgment Day in the history of the Iqua. The first, declared by Grand Mugwump Noah-Pishtin around 2800 BC, was taken in response to an asteroid impact and ensuing global tsunami and impact winter. We have reason to believe that this impact made it into the Bible as the deluge, and that Noah-Pishtin was the man we know as Noah, and that the Sumerians knew as Utnapishtim. The document each of you received on the way into the room is Noah-Pishtin's account of this event. You will notice the origins of the deluge, Tower of Babel, and Garden of Eden stories in his report. Yes, it is hard to believe. However, I assure you that it is the case. What's more, as a former Grand Mugwump, his portrait hangs in the Hall of Portraits in Atlantis, so the current Grand Mugwump can consult him for advice. If you wish, we can set up an interview so you can speak with him yourselves. Be advised, however, that you will need an interpreter, as he speaks an archaic form of Egyptian. There was an audible gasp as Dialanis continued. Atlantis does not have as much information on the Second Judgment Day, which occurred around 1600 BC. However, we have reason to believe that the threat consisted of a plague or other worldwide pandemic, and that the Grand Mugwump at the time could be the man behind the legend of Asclepius. Now, let's get to the matter at hand, a more detailed description of the events of the 20th. We on Atlantis had expected that Voldemort's death would alleviate most of the threat to civilization. However, we were wrong, And as you know, many great cities were hit with nuclear weapons as Voldemort's death curse struck, and the remaining Death Eaters and terrorist groups panicked. London was done in by Voldemort's death curse. As you know, he was British, and most of the other cities were attacked when Al-Qaeda and Hamas realized that they would lose the ability to deliver nuclear weapons when the Atlanteans rounded up all of the Death Eaters supporting their organizations. Those red balls you saw hovering over various cities were part of the Judgment Day Protocol. Their purpose was to disable all unauthorized wand use for 30 minutes once time 0, 1500 Z, arrived. They were introduced to make the operation safer for the men and women tasked with the duty of saving the world. The balls were released, and the countdown initiated at 1430 Z, when Saddam Hussein, Hosni Mubarak, the head astrologer, and I turned the keys over in Atlantis. The primary strategy for saving the world involved the use of time turners, devices which allow the user access to limited time travel. I have reason to believe that the Deputy Minister of Magic of India told you about these devices, albeit somewhat against regulations. The particular time turners used for Judgment Day were constructed so that they can send the operator back to time 0 over and over again in order to take advantage of new information which has come in from the Judgment Day rescue team. If any of you have seen the film Back to the Future, you can get a sense of what this will do. This will provide the Ministry of Magic, in effect, infinite manpower at time 0, as all of the operators will have multiple copies of themselves, known as doppelgangers, in action at the same time. These copies can interact with each other, provided that they do not interfere with each other's activities. If they were to interfere, that would create a time paradox, which would kill off the traveler as soon as he first activated the time turner. The fact that all of the operations occurred at one instant gave all of the wizards involved in the operation the advantage of complete surprise, as well as the knowledge obtained by all of the other operatives. It is a most powerful and effective use of magic. It is also highly controversial and used only for Judgment Day. Dialinus turned the page. Let me explain to you what Judgment Day looked like from my perspective as head of the operation. When 1500 Z hit, all of the wizards disappeared to go after the Death Eaters and terrorists. A few seconds later, a wizard came to me and asked for advice. As it turned out, I did not know how to respond. However, my future self had managed to obtain that information. Knowing that my present self didn't have it, he sent a doppelganger back. The doppelganger tapped me on the shoulder and provided me with the information, allowing me to deal with the problem. The wizard and doppelganger then disappeared, leaving me alone momentarily. By this point, it was roughly 1501 Z. This left me out of position by a minute. I moved over a few feet as to not interfere with doppelganger, which would interact with that first wizard and triggered the time turner, sending me back to 1500 Z. I arrived back at 1500 Z and spoke with another wizard while, next to me, my doppelganger spoke with the first wizard. It was most confusing, to say the least. I had more than 150 consultations during the Judgment Day operations. I could tell immediately how many people I had to talk to as my doppelgangers, whom I would eventually become, were all lined up in the room. Although it took only half an hour real time, from my perspective it took a good 10 hours. After finishing my last consultation and acquiring all of the knowledge I would get, I began traveling back to 1500 Z once again, providing that information to my doppelgangers. This would allow the doppelgangers to answer any questions they had not been able to the first time around. Once I was done with that, I was finished, both mentally and physically. I nearly collapsed when I was done with the operation, but we got the job done, and that's all that matters. I'll open up the floor now for questions. Experimental physics, building Oxford University Great Britain's Taylor looked at the gravimeter in front of him. This couldn't be right, he thought. Normally, the gravitational constant in the area was a standard 9.80655 m/sec2. Yet for some reason, it was now reading 9.80658. He looked around the room to see if there was something nearby which could have increased the mass in the area. There wasn't anything particularly unusual, however. Granted, there was the magical wand formerly owned by Remus Lupin and collected when Wizard Lupin had transformed into a werewolf and attacked patrons in Wembley Stadium. However, he doubted that weighed more than 500 grams. A mass that low couldn't have that much of an effect on a gravimeter reading. People had been performing various experiments on the wand for a good month. No one seemed to know how it worked, and virtually everyone who had tried to pick it up had received an electric shock, with the sole exception of Taylor. For some reason, the wand seemed to like Taylor. He had undergone a battery of tests to determine why the wand liked him, but none of them had revealed anything other than the fact that he needed to lose a little weight. Taylor made a mental note to talk to the wizards about this later. Meanwhile, he stared at the malfunctioning gravimeter. This was very puzzling. His office was on the ground floor, so he couldn't be dealing with a case where someone moved a heavy object directly underneath him. The only other possibility was that a heavy object directly on the floor above him had been removed, which prevented its mass from reducing the force of gravity in the area. He called up to the lab above him and asked him if they had done any remodeling or moving of heavy equipment over the past few days. They reported that they had nothing had changed up there. Taylor could only reach one conclusion. The gravimeter had experienced a fault or defect and needed to be repaired. Fortunately, the lab had many such machines. Shrugging, he began rolling the table with the gravimeter over to the far side of the room so he could put it away. He was surprised to see readout abruptly switch to 9.80657 halfway across the room. Figuring that this must have been a side effect of the table's motion, he halted the table and checked the readout again. 9.80657. Odd, but not entirely unexpected if the actual value in the system was something like 9.8065751. The system rounded to the nearest 10 microgals. He started pushing the table once more towards the far side of the room. He was a couple of feet away from the far wall when the display shifted to 9.80656. Taylor froze. You couldn't get from 9.80658 to 9.80656 using a rounding error. Something very strange was going on here. Scratching his head, he began moving the gravimeter back in the direction it had come from. The value on the screen jumped to 9.80657 and then back up to 9.80658. His jaw dropped when he realized what this meant. This wasn't noise. There was a mass in the area attracting it, and judging from the fact that a short distance had a palpable effect on the readout, it had to be nearby. There was nothing massive enough to accomplish such a feat. He was about to pass it off as a coincidence when he suddenly looked at the adjacent table and saw Lupin's wand sitting on it. Could Lupin's wand be affecting the gravimeter reading? He couldn't see how it would have, but if there was no other explanation, it would have to do. Besides, it would be an easy experiment to try. Leaving the gravimeter where it was, he walked over to the table and picked up the wand. He headed back to the gravimeter and watched the display as he approached with the wand. 9806599, 806609, 80661. The maximum value, 9.80662, was reached when the wand was sitting next to the gravimeter. Taylor stared at the wand and at the gravimeter in shock. This had to be a mistake or a breakthrough. Turning the gravimeter so that it faced the other way, he picked the wand back up and walked past the machine. 9806619, 80660. Taylor's eyes widened. Could magic be powered by gravity or something like that? It would explain a lot. He jotted down his observations and tried moving the wand in various directions, concluding that the direction the wand was moved in had no bearing on the results. He tried the same experiment with a second gravimeter and got the same results, which showed that the original one hadn't been defective. Finally, He put the wand back on the table and tried carrying around an object of equal mass. The display remained locked at 9.80659. Magic was powered by gravity. He was sure of it. He needed to run some more experiments to make sure. Then again, if that were the case, wouldn't the presence of the wand cause the gravitational constant to decrease as the wand consumed gravitational energy? There was a lot of stuff he needed to find out here. Hogsmeade Medical Facility, Hogsmeade, Great Britain. Harry, Dudley, Ron, and Hermione stared in shock at the man lying in the bed. Had the name Black, Sirius not been written on the bed, none of them would have recognized who he was. All of his hair had fallen out, and he had strange burns and blisters all over his body. His eyes were closed, and Harry could tell that he had suffered internal bleeding. Horrified, he turned to the doctor and asked what had happened to him. Hermione answered, "It's acute radiation poisoning, Harry. It was one of the main causes of death for the people who initially survived the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb blasts. He must have absorbed it when the bombs went off in Pyongyang. I'm sorry, Harry." The Muggle doctors couldn't do anything about it, so they sent him here. Harry turned to the witch tending Sirius. "You're a witch, aren't you? Can't you do something?" The witch shook her head. "I'm afraid not, Harry. He's too far gone, and furthermore, we have never had to deal with radiation poisoning before, especially on such a grand scale. The sickness, after all, is in effect a Muggle condition, as radiation has never been worked with in the magical world. We'll have to do research to figure out how to cure it, but I don't think we're going to be able to save him in time. I'm sorry." Harry nearly choked. "How much?" The witch answered his unspoken question. "A couple of hours, I'd say, if that. You're his godson, aren't you?" Harry fought back tears. "Yes, ma'am, I am. My parents are dead. Who will I be able to turn to now?" Ron put his hand on Harry's shoulder. "We'll adopt you, Harry. You're already a member of the family in all but name. Trust me, this won't be an issue." Harry, frantic, turned to Hermione. "Hermione, you're smart, can't you?" Hermione shook his head. "No, Harry, I'm not a qualified healer or expert on anything other than teeth. There's nothing we can do other than say goodbye." Tears began to well up in Harry's eyes. Turning to the unrecognizable man in the bed, he stammered, "Sirius, can you hear me?" Amazingly, the patient turned his head to look at Harry. It was clear that he was in obvious pain and that he was doing all he could to prevent himself from crying out. Finally, in a weak voice, Sirius responded, "Yes, Harry, I can hear you." "Sirius, I don't know what to say. Don't go. You've been the closest thing to a father that I've ever had." Sirius gasped and shook his head. "There's nothing they can do at this point, and I can feel my time is close. You've done me and your parents proud, Harry. All three of you have. You are serving as the perfect representatives of Gryffindor. You have truly avenged your parents' deaths." Hermione was sobbing as she spoke. "Is there anything we can do to help?" Sirius forced a nod. "Yes, Hermione. When I go, bury me next to Lily and James. They're in Godric. Harlow, the Black Estates, are now yours. Harry 12 Grimmauld would have been as well. But Voldemort blew it up. Also, you get ownership of Witherwings as well." Hermione frowned and turned to Harry. "Witherwings? What?" Harry understood immediately. "Buckbeak. They changed his name to make sure he wasn't killed." Sirius nodded and choked for a moment. Drawing a deep breath, he said, "Yes, Hermione, now remember your Gryffindor bravery. It's time for you to be brave." And he never got the opportunity to finish the sentence. His eyes rolled back, and his breath rattled in his throat. Alarms hooted, and the witches shoved everyone out of the way to try to tend to him. Muggle Emps ran past the three children and were soon powering up their defibrillation equipment. A tone sounded, and someone shouted, "Clear." There was jerk in the other room as the equipment started charging up again. The three kids waited in the hall. 10 minutes later, the activity in the sick room abated and halted. The nurse came out, sought out Harry, and came over to him. She put her hand on his shoulder and shook his head. I'm sorry, Harry. I'm truly sorry, and I wish I could have been as brave as he was, dying in an attempt to protect a city from a nuclear attack. Chapter 250. Sirius's Funeral. Thursday, June 27, 1996. Michael's Church Godric's, Hollow Great Britain the church, was packed as people from all over the world to pay their final respects to the man who had killed Lord Voldemort and given his life to try to protect the people of Pyongyang after the evil wizard had placed the entire city in danger. Most of the Regency Committee was there, as were Dumbledore, both Flamels, and the remnants of the British Ministry of Magic. Al Gore was representing the United States, and Kofi Annan had come in to represent the United Nations. Dionysus was not permitted to attend with Atlantis at DEFCON 4, and as a result, the magical city-state was represented by head astrologer Endukaku, who had brought along a non-functional copy of the astrologer's key. Hogwarts was represented by Snape, Aberforth Dumbledore, Slughorn, and Filch. King William and Prince Harry were both there, as was a whole division of His Majesty's Secret Service and the SAS. Prime Minister Heseltine was there as well, and the back of the church was filled with reporters and cameramen. Lost in the crowd were the 3 Hogwarts students seated in one of the front pews: Harry, Ron, and Hermione. All 3 were dressed in black, and Harry was crying softly and doing his best to accept condolences from the rest of the dignitaries in the room, and Dudley, who had been growing closer to Harry and the Weasleys once he had found himself in surroundings much different from those he had grown up in. King William had come to talk to them personally, and Ron had been surprised to discover that they weren't that much older than he was. It was obvious that William had been caught completely off guard by the unprecedented events of the past week. He admitted that he hadn't really interacted with wizards before and congratulated Hermione on her defense of East London after the bombs had gone off. He looked as if he wanted to ask her something else, but he decided against it and said that it could wait a few months. When she asked him what it was, he said that he didn't want to ruin the surprise. Several of the people tried to interview Hermione, who had become almost as popular as Sirius. Hermione, not surprisingly, refused to answer any questions until the funeral was finished. Sirius's coffin lay at the front of the church, near the speaker's lectern. Normally, the lid would have been open so the visitors could look upon him one last time. However, Harry and the rest of the people in charge of the ceremony agreed that they didn't want to have the mourner's last view be of a hairless, disfigured man. As a result, they kept the lid on the coffin. Harry had been initially horrified when he heard that Draco Malfoy had come for the funeral. He was stunned when Hermione told him that Draco had turned his life around, renounced his Death Eater past, and used his Slytherin ambition to start crusading for nuclear disarmament along with Princess Diana. Hermione suspected that Draco had decided to attend the funeral because Sirius had died from radiation poisoning. He looked around the room and saw the wizards and muggles talking to each other. Sirius would love to see this, he thought. Finally, it was time for the service to begin. The minister stepped to the podium and began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to mourn the passing of a great man, Sirius Orion Black Roman III. Imprisoned for years for a crime he did not commit, he managed to escape from his predicament and serve as a role model for the magical house of Gryffindor, whose members have been renowned for their bravery. Sirius grew up in the House of Black, a wizarding family which taught that pureblood witches were superior to those with Muggle ancestry. Disgusted with his relatives' elitism, he struck out on his own and stayed true to his beliefs even though when he was disinherited from his family, and his image was erased from his family tree. He went to the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where he was sorted into Gryffindor House and proved to be a brilliant wizard. He was close friends with James Potter, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew, all of whom are now deceased. The legendary Hogwarts Marauders have been united once again in Sheol. 14 years ago, Pettigrew betrayed his friends and turned to the service of the Dark Lord, Voldemort. When Sirius confronted him, Pettigrew faked his death and successfully framed Sirius for a crime Black did not commit. Sirius was placed in Azkaban, the wizarding prison, where he languished for over a decade knowing that he was innocent. 3 years ago, Sirius discovered Peter Pettigrew's whereabouts, took advantage of his shape-shifting ability, and escaped from Azkaban to avenge his imprisonment. Sirius's case was reopened once it became obvious that Pettigrew had survived, and he was eventually exonerated and given a substantial pension to compensate him for his time served. Sirius continued working for justice after his exoneration. He continued his crusade against evil wizards and Death Eaters, and he eventually joined His Majesty's Secret Service as a special agent. He destroyed several of Voldemort's Horcruxes, adopted James Potter's son Harry along with Harry's cousin Dudley, and drove an armored personnel carrier down Diagon Alley in the service of the forces of light. He volunteered to go Korea during the Judgment Day War to bring down Voldemort's regime. He served as the champion of the coalition forces during the duel with Voldemort, where he caught the Dark Wizard off guard and shot him with a cleverly concealed pistol. He then stayed behind when the bombs started going off, determined to do what he could to protect the people of Pyongyang from attack. Unfortunately, there was no way for him to have known that the city was going to be attacked by sea. As a result, he was caught out of position as an Allies' weapon exploded over the city, exposing him to a fatal radiation dose. Both Muggles and Wizards did what they could to help, but they arrived too late. Even the Deputy Minister of Magic, Dr. Nicholas Flamel, a man familiar with obscure and controversial magical methods of healing, agrees that nothing could have been done as no magical healing techniques have ever been developed to deal with a condition which was only discovered in 1945, well after the statute of secrecy fell into place. We lost a great man yesterday, and the world will be in his debt for many years to come. I will now open up the floor to other people who would like to say a few words. There was a rustle behind Harry, and he around to see Dumbledore standing up. The Minister of Magic walked up to the podium and nodded graciously to the minister before addressing the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I knew Sirius well. He was a brilliant man and one of the bravest people I have ever met. However, even I was caught by surprise when he emerged as the champion to bring down Voldemort. You see, the original plan had been for me to fight Voldemort, as Voldemort had always been leery of confronting me directly. Unfortunately, I was in Seoul at the time the Dark Lord issued his challenge, and was not in a position to fight him. This could have been a disaster, as I had arranged for Voldemort to obtain a powerful wand which would have defeated any opponent in a duel other than myself, the wand's rightful master. Had it not been for Sirius's Muggle weapon, that confrontation would not have been a victory. As Minister of Magic, I would like to ensure that Sirius's name live forever. To that end, it is my pleasure to announce that the building in Hogsmeade that will serve as the new headquarters for the British Ministry of Magic will be named Black Tower, after Sirius. A portrait of Sirius will be placed at the entrance so that everyone will be able to remember what this man did for the world. Everyone cheered at that. Dumbledore bowed and stepped aside as Snape came to the podium. Harry braced himself. He had no idea how Snape was going to react. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Severus Snape, headmaster of Hogwarts. Although Sirius and I never saw eye to eye on everything, I can confirm everything Minister Dumbledore said. Sirius was a fierce warrior, and he was an integral member of the Order of the Phoenix, the group of wizards dedicated to defeating the Death Eaters and bringing down Voldemort. Sirius was virtually unique among the wizarding community in that he served both openly as a wizard and Muggle special agent. Wizards who wish to interact with Muggles will likely be more common in the years to come. As a result, it is my pleasure to announce that starting in the fall of 1997, there will be a fifth house available to first years at Hogwarts, Black House. It will be dedicated to wizards who wish to serve the Muggle community. There was a universal gasp of astonishment among the wizards, including Dumbledore, who had apparently been caught completely off guard. However, the surprise was apparently welcome, and everyone came to their feet. Harry couldn't believe it. The House of Black had changed from a clan, which hated Muggles, into a community which respected them. Snape wasn't done yet, as he chuckled and shook his head. Rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, that any members of the Black family who survived Judgment Day will have all had heart attacks when they heard that proclamation. I don't think we'll have to worry about them anymore. There were scattered chuckles around the room as Snape bowed and sat down. He was followed by several more speakers. Prince Andrew, Kofi Annan, the head of His Majesty's Secret Service, a man named Banks from the SAS, and Al Gore. Suddenly, Harry found himself coming to his feet and walking to the podium. He found himself at the lectern before he even realized that he didn't have a prepared speech. He just had this tremendous urge to get something off his chest. He drew a deep breath and looked at Ron and Hermione for support. Bowing to King William, he tried to get out what was on his mind. Ladies and gentlemen, Sirius was the father I never had. I lost my parents when I was an infant and was raised by Petunia and Vernon Dursley, the couple who founded Britain for Humans and were imprisoned for discriminating against their magical nephew. I was his godson, and he supported me in everything he did. He went out of his way to do things for me, and his love for me had no bounds. I don't actually have a prepared speech right now. However, I just wanted to say goodbye to one of the best friends and greatest men I ever had the honor of meeting. Rest assured, Sirius, that I will be naming one of children after you. Rest in peace, Godfather. And thank you for everything you have done. Thank you. Harry's eyes welled up at that point, and he couldn't speak any more. The minister, sensing his distress, came back to the podium and told everyone that they would be carrying the body to the cemetery. Harry, Dumbledore, Prince Andrew, Heseltine, Dudley, and Endukaku were to serve as pallbearers. It would take Harry a long time to recover from the momentous events surrounding Judgment Day. He knew that the world had changed forever and that it was useless to dwell in the past. Harry had no idea what the future would bring, but he would do his best to be prepared for it. Chapter 251. New Muggle Vacation Destination. Thursday, June 27, 1996, United Nations, Building Geneva once again. Atlantis was at the podium to make a surprise announcement to the Muggles. Although he was certain he was doing the right thing, he had to do a lot of talking to convince the rest of Atlantis to agree with this plan. Atlantis was now at DEFCON 4. Endukaku had reported that the current odds of apocalypse had dropped to 1.8%, which was still higher than Atlantis would have expected, but he was more than happy to take it. He suspected that the abrupt economic depression triggered by the nuclear attacks on the Muggle cities probably had something to do with it. Endukaku agreed with this assessment, though he warned his boss that there were telltale signs that the latest threat would likely manifest itself in Russia or the Ukraine, and neither of those countries had suffered nuclear strikes. The fact that sorceress Kurchatova had issued a prophecy mentioning the destruction of the house of Romanov loomed heavily in Dionysus's thoughts. He couldn't worry about vague threats to Russia at the moment, as he had a gut feeling that he'd have to spend a lot of time handling immigration issues to Atlantis. He nodded to the reporters and began his speech. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am Anastasios Dionysus of Atlantis, and it is my distinct pleasure to announce a new initiative for the people of Atlantis and for the world in general. Now that the statute of secrecy has been discarded, Atlantis will be staying on the surface for the foreseeable future. The exposure of Atlantis to the Muggle world, coupled with the deaths of several Atlanteans in the Judgment Day War, has given the Muggles an unprecedented opportunity to live with and interact with wizards. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to announce that starting on January 1st, 1997, Atlantis will open its borders to Muggle inhabitants for the first time. Atlantis is going to be responsible for taking care of the wizarding world in the months and years to come. It would be remiss of us to not include Muggles in our discussions when we do so. This implies that the wizards have to interact with Muggles on a daily basis to break down any prejudices or misconceptions each side has about the other. Muggles will have two options when it comes to deciding where to live. Homes belonging to people killed in the war will become available for habitation, provided that the victims did not deed the properties to children or loved ones in their wills. These homes will be in areas surrounded by wizards. The second option will be a new Muggle district, which will be constructed over the next few months at the edge of the city. There is currently space for only 3,000 new residents. Applicants must put their names forward by October 1st, and if there are more than 3,000 candidates, the winners will be chosen by lot. We believe that this program will help ease the Muggles into wizarding society and vice versa. I urge other wizarding cities to monitor the progress of this initiative and adopt it if it succeeds. Thank you for your time, and now I'll take questions. Be advised that at DEF CON 4, I am not permitted to intervene in Muggle or wizarding politics. Oval Office, Washington, D.C. President Clinton watched as the reporter described the chaos in the Boston Stock Exchange. The Dow Jones was now under 3,200, and many prognosticators suspected that it would be below 3,000 by the end of the year. Business was starting to dry up rapidly as people began noticing that almost half of their stock portfolio had just flown out the window or disappeared in nuclear fire. This was just making a bad situation even worse, and people were starting to panic. Runs on banks were becoming commonplace, and businesses were already starting to discuss laying people off and imposing pay cuts across the board. Clinton needed to do something, but he wasn't sure what exactly he should do. He suspected that the world was overreacting to the events of Judgment Day. A good 90% of the world's markets were still intact. The big question was whether this overreaction would trigger a full-blown depression. He doubted raising taxes would help at this point, as the government still was more or less solvent. Maybe a national tax holiday would work, one which would spur business for a month or so with taxes reduced by 50%. He'd need to talk to Greenspan and people like that about this. One thing he did know is that with the world in chaos and the US still reeling from 3 nuclear strikes, well, 2.5, the US couldn't really afford to be as involved with world politics as it had been before Judgment Day. Sending money overseas wouldn't be a good idea at a time like this. Thankfully, he would be able to bring some of the troops home from the careers now that the wizards were overseeing the reunification process. That would save money to some extent. 5-tree plantation outside Seardish Syrian. Oh, Wizard Master Altry stared in shock as he heard someone apparate into the reception room behind him. Spinning on his heel, he was about to call for his yahoos to restrain the visitors when he recognized his guests. His eyes widened, and he found himself frantically trying to figure out how on earth he was supposed to interact with Foreign Minister Beshno and Chancellor Saetnan. Hoping he was doing the right thing, he shook both women's hands. "Ladies, what a surprise! What exactly brings you to my neck of the woods, and how can I help you? Do you need anything?" Saetnan shook her head. "No, thank you, Master Altry. We actually don't have much time, but we've got an important message to deliver to you, and you're not going to like it." Altry frowned. Had he done something wrong? Granted, a bunch of his slaves had escaped during the events surrounding Judgment Day. The vast majority had been recaptured and punished accordingly. 6 of them were still missing, but he was certain that they'd be returned at some point. He hoped that his slaves hadn't done something rash and hurt some politicians. Slaves who attacked wizards were killed on the spot without compensating their masters, and good slaves were hard to find. Granted, the missing ones had always been troublemakers, though the Sen-Altry couple had cooled off a little ever since they'd had their little girl, Piant. Aloud he asked, "Madame Chancellor, what's wrong? Have I or one of my missing yahoos done something wrong? Sayatnan looked at the foreign minister and drew a deep breath. You haven't done anything wrong, Master Altry. However, we have reason to believe that your 6 escaped yahoos may not be returning to you any time soon. Altry swore. Damn, I can't just lose 6 slaves like that. I only have 15 of them. What happened to them? What did they do? Sayatnan and Bershno looked at each other. Clearly something unusual had happened. Finally, Bershno gritted her teeth and began to speak. Master Altry, we found 3 of them dead. Apparently they tried to escape Círdan on a small boat and they drowned. I'm sorry, sir. Altry grunted. That explains 3 of them. What about the other 3? There was a long pause at this. Finally, Sayatnan spoke. Master Altry, we have reason to believe that they not within 50 miles of Círdan at the present time. Furthermore, the merfolk in the area have reported that their bodies have not been found. Finally, we've done some extensive searches and haven't found them on land either. Altry stared at him. What? How can that be? Were their bodies destroyed? Bershno answered this. Master Altry, we have reason to believe that they may have tried to escape on a boat of their own and been picked up by a Muggle ship headed to the continent, which is home to the United States, a powerful Muggle nation which has been deeded one of the Muggle Judgment Day keys. There may only be a matter of time until the Muggles find out that we're here. Altry swore. You mean to tell me a powerful Muggle nation is about to discover our culture and that we enslave Muggles? Sayatnan nodded. That's a distinct possibility, Master Altry. Rest assured, we're going to do everything we can to find these individuals before they can expose us. Although the Muggles can't visit Círdan, the United States' wizards certainly can. And if Nestor finds out and opens diplomatic relations with the United States, we could have Vila and Muggles all over the place here with their city-wrecking explosives. Altry nodded. Madame Chancellor, that doesn't sound good. That sounds downright bad, to be honest. I fully agree. Here is what I recommend. The name of the vessel in question is the Big Texas. Here's what it looks like so you can apparate there. I'd recommend that you head on over to the ship and pick up those slaves as soon as possible if they're on board. You can punish them however you wish. Altry kicked irritably at the wall. They'll get punished, all right. What happens if they're not there? Sayatnan's face grew grim. We need to make it that they can't expose us to the world. If necessary, we're going to have to go over there and either kidnap or kill them.